We are at page 29, still in chapter 2 of White Fragility. I am your guide, Mark Stewart. And I'm a guide on a sad but important journey through a book that is wrong in so many places and thus very likely misleading. So here's one element of wrongness. Robin DiAngelo writes, white supremacy is especially relevant in countries that have a history of colonialism by Western nations. Please remember what I said earlier, that if you replace the word white supremacy with cultural supremacy, it is a far better explainer. Cultural supremacy is a very good explainer, and it's not necessarily an evil thing. To replace a decrepit culture with a better culture has goodness. The Chinese welcomed the Mongols. They were invaded, and the eventual rulers who subdued them became allied with the people who let them continue. Genghis Khan was one of them, and Kublai and others in that dynasty became heralded because of, at the time, a superior culture. China later invaded other lands with its, at that point, superior cultural. They were probably the original capitalists. They had respect for property, and that helped the Thais that they encountered, the Indonesians that they encountered, the Tibetans that they eventually encountered. They took them over. So here in the West, you can see cultural supremacy. In North America, we no longer have the Inca practice of ripping somebody's heart out, an innocent person, not a criminal, to sacrifice to the gods. This is a better culture than what they had before. In India, thanks to British colonialism, the practice of sati, that was the burning to death of women who had lost their husbands. That was the old Indian way. It was vile, and a better culture supplanted it. So, replacing with culture, a cultural supremacy, is not a bad thing. Look, there are current Americans from Africa who are here because of a better culture, a respect for property. Culture is modern still. We have Bantus that have adopted Western clothing and sense of property rights and individualism that they didn't have before, and where their governments are still repressing them. That happens still in Africa. Those who leave for a better life in the Western world. That's why, indeed, Nigerian Americans are so prosperous. They crave the system here that'll do so well for them. So page 29 concludes by saying that white supremacy is invisible. Well, maybe it's because that is not in existence, that cultural supremacy, which is visible, is the better explainer. All right, page 31 has a list, an awful list, of the few highly successful African Americans in contrast to the vast majority that are white. It's not a fair comparison, and it's meant, I'm not even sure what it's meant to do, because it doesn't do statistical justice. They say, ooh, here's the racial breakdown of the people who control our institutions. The 10 richest Americans, 100% of them are white. The U.S. Congress, 90% white. U.S. governors, 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. So that doesn't mean that blacks are being treated unfairly. Look, blacks vote. And many of them vote for those 90% white Congress people. Black voters within the Democrat Party in the 2020 primaries voted for one white man in way more abundance than the black candidates. That would be Joe Biden, who just went so much more popular among black voters than Cory Booker or Kamala Harris, who were in the same primaries as Joe Biden. Actually, Kamala Harris dropped out very quickly, Cory Booker about a month later. Maybe black people choose to elect whites who will be good governors and not elect just based on race. To their great credit, I think that's what's going on. Robin DiAngelo doesn't seem to see that way. Oh, by the way, she doesn't seem to see the next line, which I omitted. 100% white president and vice president. She's writing about the period 2016 to 17 when 100% black was the president of the United States up until January 17. People who decide which books we read, 90% white. People who decide which TV shows we see, 90% white. Well, look, we don't know what the number of blacks in the profession are in the first place. And I have a hard time believing that they are subordinated by racism to never reach the highest elements. I think they choose not to stay in that profession all that long. Here's the certainty. Directors of top grossing films, 95% white. Well, it's to their credit that I think blacks realize it's a stupid profession. Okay? Very few films make money. Most directors are barely making it. And so success in that industry, I lived in Los Angeles for 6 years. Success in that industry is not based on merit. It's based to some extent on who you know. It's based a lot on the appearances that you have to put up with. Blacks seem to be smart enough to avoid this kind of superficial and stupid profession. Yes, in any profession, a few people will get really rich. Now, DiAngelo talks about on the next page how blacks are not nearly making the highest grossing films when they are the filmmakers. Well, it's possible that black directors might be making bad films, okay? Objectively bad films. And I'll give one maybe reason why. Because they're listening to you and trying to imbue their films with falsities and rage that shouldn't even exist. So no wonder people don't want to see their film, okay? Very good film from 2018, Green Book, okay? About race relations and very enamoring of African Americans there, produced by a white guy. And though I don't know the director's background, maybe with the idea towards I want to be entertaining instead of putting in a disconcerting message laced through my films. Here's where we have just flat out wrongness. They say, given that the majority of white people live in racial isolation from people of color, and of black people in particular, and have very few authentic cross-racial relationships, white people are deeply influenced by the racial messages in films. I think films are there for their entertainment, okay? And whites, at most, a film buff is going to spend 4 hours a week watching 2 movies, okay? This is not nearly as big an influence as a workplace, a school, a family, a religious institution that you're attending more often. Final part of chapter 2, page 33. White supremacy, she says, describes culture that positions the white people and all that is associated with them as ideal. Well, we know this isn't true either, because among whites, hip-hop is the most popular dance form. Among whites, rap is the 3rd most popular music form. Among whites, they like to emulate black speech, black clothing, and they nearly worship black performers on the athletic field. This is totally wrong interpretation. Japanese might diminish whites far more than whites seem to think less of blacks. And I don't think they even do here in modern America. Wake up to reality, Miss D'Angelo, instead of spouting your prejudgment, that is called prejudice, your prejudgment, and trying to fit things that really don't fit and haven't in at least 40 years. I'm Mark Stewart.